All right. Hello, everyone. Hope everyone is doing well. So my name is Tegan. We're going to get started pretty soon. If you'd like to open up the discussion, if you want to introduce yourself, and if you have any questions even before we start, it's great to see some friendly names here. All right. Well, here we go. So I'm really excited to be presenting about what I call embodied literacy. Really, we're talking about the kinds of learning like empathy and social skills that happen in our body. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Tegan Reeves. I work at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, and I also teach at Rhodes College, a small liberal arts college here in Memphis, Tennessee. Not a mother, but I do have 8 little paws running around my house. So this is a picture of my cat and my dog. And of course, not pictured here, but very dear to my heart are my godchildren. I have 3 goddaughters and a godson, and it's been really wonderful to be able to apply some of the learning that I'm going to be talking about today, and seeing them grow. And I can't wait to hear your stories and a little bit about what your children are growing and doing as well. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we're going to do today. So this is a live and as interactive as possible session, and we have 3 big sections. So first I'll talk a little bit through the science and what is happening in the body and what kind of developmental stages there are. And then I'll get into the implications, and so how this might affect our lives, especially as growing children. And then later we'll talk a little bit more about tips and tricks, different practices and mindfulness practices, and activities that you can do with your children to grow some of these different aspects. So first up is the science of embodied literacy. And this is really my favorite, because when we start to really talk about what's happening in the body, it gets pretty interesting. So if we look at the body, a lot of what we think of as embodied learning is in our brain and in our gut and maybe in our blood, but it's a whole lot more than that. In fact, there's what we call the brain stem, which is a part of the brain that gives us a lot of information. So if you look at this picture, if you can see that brain stem and you can kind of imagine it all the way down, it goes into all of the cavernous spaces in our body. So we have these afferent and efferent nerves, and all that means is that we have these nerves that communicate to the brain and also get communication from the brain. And they're in these cavernous spaces. So you can imagine we have these nerves in our stomach, in our rib cage, and it goes all the way to our fingertips, and it gives us information. And what's really, really important about that is that single central line, that brain stem, has a nerve called the vagal nerve. And what we know now more and more is that that vagal nerve is not just receiving information, but also making decisions. And so some of those decisions are things like if we're in threat or if we're safe, that vagal nerve is what's telling our body what to do. So many of you have probably heard of fight or flight. And this is our nervous system receiving information before our brain does. Our nervous system is receiving information, and it's saying, okay, I have to run really fast, or I should retreat, and maybe this isn't safe. And it's really important, because when that happens, it puts our brain in a place where we can focus in. We get an increase of dopamine, and the glutamine, or our go system, receptors start to go, and we focus in. So if you think about this kind of evolutionarily, if we were running from tigers, we would be able to focus straight on running really, really fast, and not stopping and saying, oh, maybe I should go this direction, or maybe this way would be an easier run, or maybe I should, because then of course the tiger would catch us. So when we have this go system and when we can focus in, then our parasympathetic nervous system is firing. This is where the fight comes. So if you see this image, we have this fight or this I'm going to go really fast. We also have the parasympathetic nervous system, which is our calming. And our calming system is what receives information like social cues. So our vagus nerve, so you can see here on the left of your screen, we've got this calming system. That is our parasympathetic nervous system. And then on the right, we've got this, okay, it's go time. And so again, this is all happening before our thought processes. And this is a really important way to understand social interaction. And right now, I think you can maybe hear my dog's sympathetic nervous system is going pretty wild because there's a mailman. So I love that I get to be home and talking to you guys, and I'm sorry about that noise. So our social system is the way that our vagus nerve is starting to receive information. And when it receives information from social cues, we're starting to learn whether we feel safe or whether we feel a fight response. And this kind of space, thank you for Morgan for saying hello to Magnolia. This kind of space is where we can start to really engage. So I'm gonna talk. Thanks, you guys, for being so understanding. I'm going to talk a little bit more about how these ways of engaging are developed over time. And I've put these three really, really basic ages: under 1 year old, between 2 and 4 years old, and then above 4. And so these are really basic ages in a lot of the developmental and educational psychology communities. We're starting to get a little bit further away from having these specific ages and stages, because what we're really learning, and I think this is maybe important for all of us, is that we don't just develop linearly, and our brain is really flexible and elastic. We call this neuroplasticity. And so if we're talking about some of these ways that we develop, I'm going to talk about what... Thank you, Christy. I really appreciate that. I really enjoy how this can be a true social space. It's true. Thanks, Bex. All right. So when I'm talking about some of these, I'm using some of the education and development literature that we've seen throughout the last 50 and 60 years. And the first and maybe the most important around social engagement is John Bowlby's work on attunement and attachment. And so attachment is something that there's lots and lots of research out about how we engage in relationships. But what we really know is that we are developing a sense of trust and attachment at a very, very early age. And many researchers think as early as 1 and 2 minutes that this kind of attunement starts to happen. And so attunement is when a baby, and or again, remember neuroplasticity, so this can happen throughout our whole entire lives. It's just really, really important right at those early stages. But when a baby is finding a way to engage emotionally with what they're seeing. And so I think all of us have maybe had this experience of holding a baby, or I know my godson would just look really, really with big eyes. And if I made big eyes, then he would make another facial expression, and we could share these different facial expressions. And at the most basic level, that is what attunement is. This can become much more nuanced, right? So we can start to attune in a way that when we are sitting next to someone, we change our body language. And so when we're working with kids, there's a lot of spaces where, especially when they get to be a little bit more into their adolescence, where if I lean back or if I lean forward and I have my hand close to my face, I'm giving these nonverbal precognitive, or before it goes into our brain, right? Remember the brain stem that we were talking about? I'm giving these signals that's allowing attunement, emotional attunement. And that is really the very, very seed of empathy. And so this is, again, really, this is happening a lot under 1 year old, and it is happening through our whole entire lives. And we know we have these really plastic brains, so maybe it didn't happen as much under 1, and it can happen at 2 and 3 years old, or maybe it didn't really start happening until 6 and 7. And while some attunement has to happen for development and survival, we do know, again, that all of these skills can happen at any age. So going to 2 and 4, when we're in this space, as we've started to learn a little bit more of attunement, and as we're starting to kind of interact with the world a little bit more, the places where we really see development of this system, this social system of being able to receive information in our cavernous spaces or in our gut reactions, we see a lot of this development in things like play and pretend, and definitely stories. And this is one of the reasons why I love the Moshi stories so much, because it's really helping us engage with the system that receives and gives our body information about whether or not this interaction or this environment is safe, and eventually gives us the power for empathy. That really happens in these stories and in the spaces where we can play and pretend. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into some of the implications later. And so really, again, this can happen at any age, and we can see it as early as 2, but around 4 and 5 is when perspective taking starts happening. And when I say perspective taking, this is a lot of what the literature is looking at that is very cognitive. And so it's thinking through, is somebody else feeling something, or what is somebody else feeling? And I think that that's really important. I try to remind myself that when I'm working with the little ones, because I think sometimes I forget that it takes a while to get from the place where we have attunement to where we're really thinking about somebody else's perspective. So I've given a lot of information about kind of the science behind some of this stuff, and this will inform us a little bit later, but I think that I'd like to open it up for some questions. Maybe give us some time to talk through some of this. So I'll keep, for the next 5 or 10 minutes, I'll just keep this open, and I know all of our amazing producers behind the scenes are working through the production, and they'll be able to pull up some of your questions and I'll answer. Oh, yes. So Christy says that her 2-year-old son pretends to be a firefighter. And I just love that, because I think it's that pretend. It's really activating the systems of how we start to empathize and how we start to grow. And then also the firefighter is such a cool imagery, because it's helping us activate our sympathetic nervous system, which we know practicing is good to do. And also there's clearly a helper in there, and helping behavior really young is really good to identify. So Morgan asks, how can we help young children start to work through some of that? And so I'm going to cite Piaget. Jean Piaget was one of the first developmental psychologists that really worked through some of these ideas of play. And play is such an important concept, especially under 2. And so it's really, sometimes it's counterintuitive to think about play because we see a lot of individual play. And what we don't realize is even that individual play or that alone time where we're playing with blocks or dolls or putting things together or taking things apart, all of that is play. And that sort of play is helping us build our social skills. Even though we're not particularly with another individual, that's where that pretend play, like we were talking about with the firefighter, starts to come in. So encouraging play, and it can be as simple as allowing for some alone time and allowing for some exploration. And there's definitely also some spaces where we can tell stories, we can ask for more stories, and we can kind of keep moving that development forward. So Alexandra asks, what does the theory of mind have to do with social and emotional learning? And I'm so glad that somebody brought up the theory of mind. We are actually going to talk quite a bit about theory of mind in a little bit, but in case anybody has to hop off, just to answer that quickly now, theory of mind is just, fancy psychologists speak for the understanding that other people have other thoughts than ourselves. And so when we say theory of mind, we're talking about the developmental moment and or stages and or spaces that we start to think, oh, this person doesn't have the same thoughts that I do, and then escalating into this person doesn't have the same feelings and or then beliefs that I do. And obviously, theory of mind is something that we can all work on and maybe really need to work on right now, to remember that other people have different beliefs, but that starts to develop even as early as 3 and 4. Hi, Robert. Oh, it's good to see you. So Robert asks about the tips to build and support empathy with an older child. So one thing that we talked about a little bit when we were starting in with the science is that what we're finding more and more now is that our brains, and when I say brains, I'm also talking about our brain stems, all of our nerves are, we call them neuroplastic. And I don't like plastic because plastic, when I think about plastic, I think about hard things. But what it really means is that they're really, really flexible. Our brains are really flexible, and they're constantly learning and they're constantly growing. And the synapses and all of the things that help us be who we are can be developed at any age in life. So the things that we are talking about can be scaled. I think that that's a word that we all use a lot, but they can be scaled for later. So for example, some of the spaces where we talk about play and pretend and stories from 2 to 4 can be scaled for older 11 and 13, and even for, well, I mean, I turn 29 every year, but even for us adults too. So if we are scaling storytelling and pretend, for an 11-year-old, maybe that doesn't look as much like some of the more simplistic stories. And maybe instead we're talking a little bit about story development. You can tell stories. You can also have a daughter or a son make up stories. And then we can pretend in those spaces. Also, later on, at the third part of today's workshop, we're going to talk about some more practices, some games that you can play, and some other ways that you can start to develop these sorts of skills. So I think we'll do maybe one more question. Bex says Bex's son is on the spectrum and just started being empathetic, which is really incredible to hear, but where he gets very upset. So I'm really glad, Bex, that you put quotations around the word normal, because a neurotypical behavior is actually not as normal or as typical. We all have ways that we're learning and growing. This sort of stage where the empathy becomes something that's upsetting is actually what neuropsychologists would call a maladaptation in that brain center receiving information. And so what starts to happen, what some psychologists think is, developmental psychologists think is, if we start to systematically introduce this kind of empathy and help put words to it. Dan Siegel talks about naming to tame. And so when we start to feel emotion so much that it becomes so powerful and it's hard to really not get into that fight or flight system, naming to tame helps us re-engage our prefrontal cortex, or the place where our parasympathetic nervous or a calming system starts to come in. And so what I'm saying with all of that is that it's a really good thing that we can be so empathetic that it really upsets us. And in fact, that's a really beautiful behavior, and ways that we can start to, in that moment, help is naming or putting an anchor on it, and then talking through it, or going more into that cognitive space. And again, a little bit later, we're going to talk about some activities that we can do to help those like high stress times, to help give us some tools that we can pull from and maybe practice a little bit more. All right. So we're going into implications for early childhood. And I'm going to talk through a couple different ways that we look at regulation and emotion regulation to help see how this impacts our lives. So the first is the emotion regulation cycle. And so we've talked about, thanks Bex, we've talked about this vagal nerve, or this brain stem, and how it receives information and then it gives information, right? And so we talked about it in this fight or flight or safety space, but there's also ways that this starts to act within what psychologists call the regulation cycle. So we have the self-regulation cycle. The first and most important component is the situation that we're in. That can be the gut reaction that we're getting for the person that we're sitting next to. That can also be the past experiences that have given us a reason for this gut reaction. And then something called affect happens. And it's important that we know what affect is, because we'll talk about it a little bit later with theory of mind. But what affect is, it's not like when you affect something, although I suppose there's similarities. What affect is actually is it's the embodied, or the body's response before we label it as an emotion. So there's a really great researcher that talks about how our brain is just guessing when we have emotions. Like, emotions are really just kind of educated guesses about what our surroundings are. The affect is the body's way of sensing or perceiving that then goes into that educated guess of emotion. And so affect happens before attention. So we receive information before we actually attend to it or hone in on it. And the attention part is where some of these skills, like mindfulness, or like practicing listening to stories, or practicing conscious listening, that attention helps us, because within the emotion regulation cycle, attention, if we can give more attention to it, and obviously this grows more and more as we grow, if we can give more attention to it, then it creates more room to properly appraise how we're going to react. And this is, I think, so important as children are starting to develop and they're starting to feel all of this affect, and their brains and their brainstem is starting to make these relationships where we're figuring out what those educated guesses of emotions are. The ability to attend or to really feel and pay attention to what this situation is will help us create space between stimulus and response. Oh, yes. Thank you, Chelsea. Conscious listening is a really fun activity. And I'm just made a mental note to add that to the list of tips and tricks, because you can do it in a 3-step process, kind of like a game. I think we all maybe could help build our own conscious listening a little bit more. So finally, so I've talked a little bit about, stimulus and response and how we learn to attend. So that helps us appraise the situation, really figure out what our emotion is instead of just feeling and reacting. And then comes our response. And so this emotion regulation cycle is really, really nice for us to remember as parents, as teachers, as friends, as dog owners, because we can identify something in this cycle that helps us see if there's a flip. So maybe we can take the situation away, but maybe not. Maybe we can strengthen our attention so that we can better appraise. Or maybe that appraisal, a different appraisal, would change how we respond. And each of these spaces is spaces that we can all learn and grow and develop, but especially as these situations, this social learning that the brainstem receiving information is so new. These are the times where we can really develop it well. So I'm going to move to the next slide, which is social engagement. And the ways that this emotion regulation cycle happens is not in a vacuum. It's not in the individual. So earlier, when I was talking a little bit about Piaget and how important Piaget says that play is, even if it's individual play, that pretend is impacting how we're socially interacting. This cycle interacts in 4 very important and very specific ways to help develop our ability to connect socially. First is connection and attunement. And when we're talking about connection, we're talking about the connection with another being. And maybe it's an animal, maybe it is a pretend animal or an imaginary animal. I just actually found out that I had an imaginary camel friend when I was little. I can't believe that I lived however many decades and didn't know that. But these are the spaces where we connect or we care. And then equally as important, all of these are equally important, is trust. So being able to know that we are in a safe space to make choices, to decide or fail or be wrong is really important. I'd love to hear from you guys if you want to tell us a little bit more about ways that these social engagement items happen. The other 2 really important spaces are building autonomy and autonomy. Well, Magnolia does not have autonomy because she can't go outside right now. So that's a good example if you can hear her. But autonomy is the ability to make choices and to feel free to make choices, which is very important as we're engaging in social interactions and social learning. And then equally with autonomy is to be able to set boundaries and say, no, thank you, I don't want this right now. And so there's a movement around sharing that really, I think, epitomizes some of this. And so, so when we're talking about sharing, often as parents, we really want to make sure that our child is sharing. And I know when I'm with Harper and somebody else comes over, I really want that other person to feel like they're part of it. And so I'll tell Harper to share. But there's a way to shift my language as her godmother to help her share in a way that she has autonomy to make the choice, and that she's able to make good boundaries and say, this is what acceptable sharing is. And yeah, so Morgan asks, how do we encourage sharing without making it feel forced? And so this is this idea of when I'm with Harper and one of our friends comes over, instead of me saying, Harper, share, or Harper, we share, I can say, Harper, this is your friend Anne, and Anne looks like she really wants to play with this ball. How would you feel if you didn't have a ball? Would you want to share it, right? And so that's automatically then engaging this empathetic response. And sometimes Harper says no. And so then we can say, okay, Harper, it's important that you have boundaries, and you can choose whether you share or not. And so at this space, Harper then, when she can say, I can choose whether to share this ball, she has autonomy to make that choice. And we can then say, how important is that ball really to you? Is it so important that you're going to set this boundary? And if you're setting this boundary, then maybe I'm going to take Anne over here, and Anne and I are going to play with something. And so often that is when Harper decides, oh, the ball is really not as important because I want to be playing with you guys. And this is really, it's easy for me to say, and I know how hard it is in action. And I think sometimes really being conscious of this sort of stuff is where we can start to move forward. Thanks again, Morgan, so much for that question. Okay, so we're going to move to the next slide. I told you guys we'd talk about theory of mind, and so this is where we do. And if you're on a small screen, I'm realizing now that it might be kind of difficult to read this. So, so my apologies, but I'll tell you about each of these aspects. So earlier we had somebody ask about, I think it was Alexandra maybe, that asked about theory of mind. And what I said then was that theory of mind is this idea that, thank you, Alexandra said, what does theory of mind have to do with social and emotional learning? And so the idea of theory of mind is that we eventually develop, a lot of people think that you'll hear the word egocentrism if you read lots of parenting books. So a lot of people think that when we're born, we think that the world revolves around us. And that there is a shift in that paradigm to not just, awesome, so you can kind of see what's around that on the bottom of the screen now, so that maybe will help. But there's a shift to not just the world is revolving around us, but that there are other people in the world and that they might have different thoughts and eventually different beliefs. And so there is 5 important components of theory of mind. 3 of those components are forms of empathy, but it's really important to distinguish these different forms of empathy. And so we have empathy as thought, as feeling, and then we have empathy that we can learn. So I'll talk through each of these. Empathy as thought, or cognitive empathy is how it's usually talked about, is the ability to think about how I would feel if I was in this person's shoes, or how I would feel if the thing that just happened to my friend happened to me. And cognitive empathy is really important because of the situations like when I was talking about Harper and her ball, that we can talk through this process and we can rationalize or apply logic to the ways that we're interacting in the world. But the other part of empathy that is really important is the felt sense of empathy. And this is a lot harder to apply to a lot of different paradigms. And so it's basically what I'm saying is sometimes it feels a little bit abstract, but it's really important because it's the affect. If you remember when we were talking about affect is precognitive emotion. So it's the feeling that we get when we feel for others. It's a little bit about when Dex was saying that, I think Dex's son was feeling so much because they were starting to feel empathy. I know my goddaughter Cameron felt so much empathy, but at first she didn't realize that it wasn't cognitive. It was a felt sense of somebody next to me is really sad and I'm really sad. Sometimes it wasn't even the talking through a situation, but it was a felt sense. And what we know about this, Morgan, I see your question. So if you could keep it up for just a moment, and then I'm going to finish this thought. But what we know about this is in mirror neurons. We know that there are mirror neurons that, for example, if one of you had something in your eye, my eye would start watering. Or there's a lot of things around kind of phantom limbs, or if we see an injury that like cringe, like if we see somebody break their arm on TV even, and you kind of like hold your arm and cringe. We know that there are these neurons that react in empathetic ways. And what we are finding is this affect, which is going to be what I'm about to talk about with Morgan's question. This affect, or this felt sense, can empathize too. And I think as parents and as teachers and people who have worked with kids, a lot of us have maybe seen this, but it's really hard to put a finger on it. And what we know now is that there's science behind it, that we have a felt sense of empathy. So Morgan asks, how do we encourage the affect place to kids? And is it teachable? And I love that question so much. Thank you, because it's so important. I think we maybe possibly, although again, I turn 29 every year, but maybe we are of this generation where it was so important to control, and that learning and development and what our parents learned in all of their parenting books was how to go through every single one of these stages. And what sometimes happens is we sometimes start to control emotion and say, you can't feel this, or you shouldn't cry, or you shouldn't feel. And the more we take away autonomy for affect, the less we'll attend to the felt sense. And so I work with athletes a lot, and I talk about right anger. And right anger, when we talk about right, like correct, right anger is when something happens, usually it's something unjust, and we're angry about it. And sometimes we have control and can do something, and sometimes we can't. But acknowledging that right anger is really, really important, because what we all know happens if we don't acknowledge that right anger is that we pretend that we're not mad, even to ourselves. And then we're really, really, really mad, like we shouldn't be this mad if we stub our toe, or if somebody cuts us off in traffic. And so thank you, Monica, for this question. Starting to allow, I think the first stage of this, to even Monica's question, starting to allow for affect when it happens, and then name it, or then appraise it, is really, really important to develop this right anger. So Monica asks, how do we teach children to have empathy? And I think, like I was saying, stage one is what we know is acknowledging the affect. The brainstem is receiving information. we're getting a gut reaction, we're feeling an emotion. It might be from something that happened before, it might be from something that we see, it might be from something that we feel, but we're getting information and then we appraise it. And what's beautiful about the human system is that we feel empathy. Our brains do. Just like we grab our arm when we are watching a soccer player who breaks it, our brains are feeling empathy. They have those mirror neurons. And so it's there. It's naturally there. And the thing that we can really do to develop it is allow for it and to help talk through it. And we do these things like we tell stories and we think about what characters go through, and we think about what we would do if we were those characters, and we engage in these sorts of spaces. And I think it's so important that you guys know as parents that you're doing it right already, and that there's nothing wrong with things like anger or frustration or tears if we allow for the space to develop and learn and grow with them. So as you can see in this cycle, we have these stages of affect that start with affect as a feeling and as a thought, and then move to something that we're learning and we're developing, we're talking through, we're playing pretend, we're imagining ourselves in the other's shoes or in the character's shoes, or we're thinking about how Goldie did this mindfulness and what Goldie did, right? And this is what we know, and Piaget and many other developmental psychologists know, develops our moral or ethics system. And importantly, all of this is what helps us develop our identity. And so when we develop theory of mind, not just by how we feel, how others feel, but we also develop theory of mind, or this idea that other people have their own belief systems, because we understand who we are and what our belief system is, where our boundaries are, whether the ball is really, really important and I only want to play with it, or whether the ball isn't as important as playing with and then we share or we play with something different. And all of these are our spaces where we develop all throughout our lives, but children are really lucky because they get to really work hard and develop in this space. So yeah, so Chelsea says, how do you tell the difference of not sharing and a child who really likes her alone time? Oh gosh. So, I mean, that's such a good question, because I think that as we're talking about, developing our identity and alone time being important, I think that it's okay to need and want alone time. And it's also important to learn how we interact with society and when we can have bigger or stronger boundaries and when not. And we so often just enforce things like Harper had to share the ball. And when I took that autonomy away from Harper and made her share the ball, that in fact strengthened her desire to have her alone time later. And so allowing for autonomy, I also find that it really helps to say, if in the example with Harper and the ball, if I say, Harper, if we're talking about autonomy and I say, Harper, would you like to share the ball? She'll say no. I could then say, Harper, our friend Anne is here, so I want you to be able to have autonomy. Maybe I'll even say that because kids are way smarter than we think. I want you to be able to set your own boundaries. Would you like to share the ball, or should we put the ball away and what can we share with Anne? And then that starts to help us see, okay, this is a situation where I'm going to be social. And so the ball's really important to me. And so I want to play with something else. But again, usually we realize that, oh, well, no, I want to play. And so I'm going to share the ball. Especially if Anne and I go into the the corner and and we are playing with something else, Harper usually wants to come and play. I'm not sure if that's the same situation that you are having, Chelsea, but so I'd love more questions. If you guys have more questions around this, I'd love to talk a little bit more about what you're going through and what you've seen. All right, so Monica says, I want to feel what they feel, but growing up, I was often comforted when I was sad. Yeah. Oh, I totally see that. Okay, so Monica says that when you were little, Monica, she was little, and the same for me. When I was sad, it helped me to say, okay, I need to stop crying. And that is actually, there's nothing wrong with that. I think that validation is important no matter what, right? So saying you are crying and this is the situation that you're in, it's okay to be sad, but also this is where we have to stop crying. And so the question is, how can we remind ourselves to pause and listen instead of trying to be the fixer? And so I want to really encourage you, Monica, and all of you parents out there that as parents, you are that comfort and that fixer, and that it's sometimes really okay to say, hey, this is what we're going to do and we're going to share, or this is what we're going to do and I see that you're sad, but we can't cry here. And as parents, as teachers, we are allowing for our children to see their surroundings, but we're also helping them see what are proper boundaries and etiquette, and that's okay too. So what I would say is, and with my experience and what we know about development, is that it isn't so much about not crying or stop crying as it is about that little piece of, this is how you're feeling, or how are you feeling, right? Like that little piece of, okay, pay attention to this. And then I understand that you feel sad, or I understand that you feel angry. And that, man, I find that helps me in my relationships too. When I can validate, when I can say, yeah, I see that. And then let's talk a little bit more about how we can have right anger in the right place, or right tears in the right place. Such good questions, you guys. Oh, okay. So the redirection of anger and anger itself, if you look at the regulation cycle, or if you think back to the regulation cycle where we have the situation and we have affect and appraisal, and then that attention and appraisal, and then our response, there are a couple things that are really important. And especially for the older ages, like teenagers and adults, that appraisal to situation is what starts to get smaller. What ends up happening over time is that we start to, the space between stimulus and response gets smaller. We start to just react instead of attending to what's happening. What's really cool is that as you see in younger and younger children, there's a little bit more time, but maybe less regulation on the response part. So if we're talking about right anger, for example, validation is the first step, right? I see that you're angry, or are you feeling mad, or what do you think is making you want to feel so mad? And what's brilliant is Dan Siegel talks about how our system that has that emotion, the amygdala, the very center of our brain, if this is your brain, when we're mad, it's not connecting to the prefrontal cortex. And so what we know is that if we say, can you label these feelings, that is immediately connecting the prefrontal cortex, or what the thinking, labeling, to the feeling. So automatically being able to label or talk or explain why, and it doesn't even have to be why, it can just be, this is what I'm feeling, that helps to connect us or to calm us down. And then the other step is to give autonomy and to be able to set boundaries. So saying, let's talk about what is making us angry. I'm really, really mad because I stubbed my toe. Or maybe I'm really, really mad because I didn't get time with dad today or mom today. And so we can say, let's talk about that. We can validate that. And then we can say, well, you get to choose how you respond to that. So the autonomy piece is you can be mad and you can stomp around if the situation is appropriate and you're maybe at home. Or we can set some boundaries. And it says, so Monica says, is it okay to give a child something to take their anger out on, something like a calm corner? And that's a really interesting question, because I think that things like a calm corner or going to the corner, if they are a choice of, hey, we're activating right now, right? If we've talked through even this brain, we're activating. And you can choose to go there to start to calm down, then that's already giving the child autonomy, and it then isn't a punishment. It gives us as parents a little bit of time too. And instead it's a space where we can grow a little bit and choose that. Or maybe we can choose to write a letter if we're for the older. I know we had an 11-year-old. Robert said he had an 11-year-old. So maybe it's a letter that we're writing down, and then we can, maybe definitely a letter and not an email, because especially at those ages, the impulsivity to send it is a little bit easier. But maybe we write it physically down. So these choices around here's where we're activating and here's where we can calm. All right, so I think that we're going to, I'll give just another 30-ish seconds. Does anyone have any other questions, anything else that, as far as the science, the brainstem stuff, or the implications? And if nobody does, we're going to move into our tips and tricks section. So this last section is where we're going to talk about different activities that we can do. And so these are different tips and tricks in 3 specific areas. First is practices. So when I'm talking about practices, I'm talking about things that we can do together with our children. We can create space, so it's sort of a game, and that these can support future learning. The first is the body mirroring game. So the body mirroring game is exactly what it sounds like. It's taking our bodies in different ways and then mirroring each other. And so it can be as simple as, if you guys are up on the screen, if you want to put your hand up to the screen, a body mirroring game can be as simple as, while you're watching me, you get to do this and then this. And so just this is building our mirror neurons. Just being able to follow this, right? That's a really simple game, and we can do it really, really, really young. And it can expand to social practices like putting our hands on our hip and standing with our legs really wide and lifting our chest up. And what's really cool is, we start to do this body mirroring game, we're building the empathetic neurons. We're building the spaces where we're seeing and responding and attuning. And we can build them even more to say, when you stand with your hands on your hip and your chest up really high, how does that feel? And we can stand there and do it and talk about our feelings at the same time. Physical practices, especially in some of these younger ages, I would say, again, we're all neuroplastic, so any ages, but I would say between like 4 and 15, and even with some of my 19 and 20-year-olds that I teach, these physical practices are so good. So I'm going to just a really quick tangent with that. When we have a teenager who is hyper activating, if if we say the words pay attention or calm down, that does nothing. But if you tell that teenager to put their hand on their nose and stand on one foot, their systems automatically calm. And so we're engaging the whole body in these different activities. So going from a really, really embodied activity like body mirroring and being able to do different shapes with our body, and then maybe even talk about what they feel like, we're moving to something called loving kindness. And this is a much, much more cognitive activity. This is a really good activity to do as a practice when we're already calm, maybe when we're getting ready for bed. It's a very common mindfulness or meditation practice for adults. It's called loving kindness or metta, but we can adapt it for children. And what loving kindness is, or what metta meditation is, it's a 3-step process. We say safe, we say happy, and something else. So safe, happy, maybe it's healthy. Safe, happy, maybe it's grateful. But it's 3, and safe and happy are almost always included. And we start with ourselves. So we start by saying, may I be safe? May I be happy? May I be healthy? And we actually imagine what me being safe feels like, and me being happy, and me being healthy. We can then say, may mom be safe? May mom be happy? May mom be healthy? And then we move forward into grandma or grandpa or dad or our friend at school. And this is something that a lot of you already do. I know a lot of people will say prayers for their family and friends. And that's a really great way to practice loving kindness. It is the act of and the practice of imagining safe, happy, and healthy, or whatever that third one is that you add in, for other people. And especially in teenage years, this practice of safe, happy, healthy, we can extend into people that are more challenging, right? So we all remember adolescence, and adolescence is hard, and we fight and we get mad and we feel offended. And the spaces to be able to say, safe, happy, healthy for that person is a really strong development point. So finally, the practice of a body check or a body scan. When we're adapting for kids, I will say that it's really important to focus on the stomach, the chest, the throat, and the cheeks. And the reason why is that when we go back to that science and we know about the brainstem and the receiving information, we know that the cavernous spaces are where our vagal nerve interacts a lot. So we know that our stomach gets gut reactions. We know that our chest, when we're in threat, our diaphragm doesn't fully pull down, so we don't get as much breath, and our chest feels restricted. We know that our throat feels restricted and it doesn't fully open, just like the diaphragm doesn't fully dilate, right? If you guys think about when you're stressed out, all of these things are how we feel. And we know that our cheeks get red. We blush. And so being able to, in a practice, say, how does your stomach feel? How does your belly feel? How does your chest feel? How does your throat feel? How do your cheeks feel right now? Being able to practice that appraisal and attention develops our system of checking in and knowing what feels safe, so that when we don't feel safe, we can also check in. And that's really, really important. So a body scan is a great practice that you can do, and you can kind of like feel your fingers and toes and all the way up. But especially for children, being able to practice this, how does my belly feel? How does my chest feel? Is really, really important. And helps us develop our ability to check in and to know what systems are working for us. So I'd love to take a couple questions. Yeah, Mary Beth says that we all do have highly scheduled days, and it doesn't allow for a whole lot of alone time. How important is it to provide alone time without technology for creative play? That's a really great question. I think that as we get into more and more scheduled time, we start to see these spaces where maybe small check-ins work. The best news is that small check-ins work. 5 minutes, if we were talking about the body check, right? So 5 minutes to kind of think, how does my belly feel? How does my chest feel? How do my cheeks feel? And allowing for that is really powerful. There's also time where creative play can happen regardless of, and it does depend on age, but regardless of technology. So things like listening to the Moshi stories, that is alone time where there can be space where our minds can play and pretend. And that sort of space can be with technology. It's technology. I always say when we're talking to educators sometimes forget that a pen and pencil is also technology. It's all technology. It's just that it's a blank piece of paper is a lot harder to go down a whole rabbit hole with. So allowing for time for creative play can look like a lot of different things. The real question was, how important is it to provide alone time? Especially in the earlier years, so maybe like up until 5 and 6, I would definitely suggest both alone time and interactive time, and trying to have space for that every single day. And then if you kind of think about that theory of mind, as our identity, that identity circle starts to develop, we start to learn what our preferences are. And if, for example, your child feels really, really depleted and feels like when I'm around people, I give all my energy and then I'm really exhausted at the end of the day, maybe that's a good space to allow him or her to explore their own boundaries and say, is that something where maybe next week we'll try an hour or half an hour of your own time and see if you have more energy, or if you feel like you would rather be around people. And this is where we all get to develop our own personal identity and our individual differences. Jonathan says, any tips on controlling my child's emotional outbursts? Yes. So we're actually going to talk a little bit about that in the next slide. But before we do, one of the best tricks to jump onto, I'm not sure if you were here when we talked about the John Siegel's name it to tame it. But what we know is that when our brainstem receives all of this information and it thinks I'm not safe and it goes into fight or flight, our diaphragm goes up, our chest constricts, our cheeks get red that we just talked about. All of that happens, and then it's an outburst. It's escalation, and it's everything's big. And what is also happening inside the brain, if you pretend this is the brain, the little center of the brain, right in the middle, the little center of the brain is not fully connecting to the prefrontal cortex, or the outside of the brain. And Dan Siegel calls it flipping your lid. And so naming it, saying, hey, name your emotion right now. What is it that you're feeling? Automatically thinking about naming it connects the prefrontal cortex to the emotion center through the Werther center and our language centers. So that's always a good tip to start, but it does, our kids do get sensitized from it. So there's some other activities that I will talk about as soon as I answer Chelsea's question. So Chelsea says, do we discuss emotions, outbursts right at the moment, or wait until they calm down and have a quiet, comforting place to discuss? Oh, what a great question. So when we're having an outburst and when we're escalating, it's really important to be aware of our surroundings. And when we were talking earlier about how as parents and as teachers, we're helping set those boundaries and understand what's appropriate, this is where this is really important, because safety has to happen, right? Our system is built for running from a tiger, that we talked about before. And so we have to be able to take a child out of the perception of not being safe. And sometimes that means that we can't sit down and talk about the emotions. And instead, sometimes that means that we need to bring safety first. And sometimes that means that we're at home and the outburst is happening and we can then remind our child of safety. And it's a good time to talk about emotions. But that naming it to tame it is really that space where if used, if and when used and we can really anchor, it helps us to calm down a little bit. So you can probably see the slide. This is during escalation. So during escalation, there are these 3 activities that I like to use, and they come paired with a practice beforehand. So naming it to tame it, like I said before, is something that you can just do anytime. Also, I said before, touch your nose or stand on one foot is, especially for adolescents, helps us de-escalate. But if we set up these 3 practices beforehand, then we can pull them in during escalation when we start to see emotions start to go wild. So yours or mine is an emotion game that is, I think, a really good starting point. So especially when we're talking about empathy, we can label our emotions as these are my emotions or these are your emotions. And so this game of, I see, if I'm talking to Briar and I'm saying, Briar, I can see that you're really sad right now. Are those your emotions or are they my emotions? That connects our prefrontal cortex. It gives us a label and an identity. And it also creates a space where a child is allowed to say, I don't know. I don't know why I'm mad right now. I don't know why I'm sad right now, but they're not my emotions. So Monica says, if your child doesn't have words to express, what if your child doesn't have words to express what they're feeling? And that's such a great question, because often we don't have words to express it, and that's okay. So one thing that really helps is, how does your stomach feel? How does your chest feel? How does your throat feel? How does your cheeks feel? And if we still don't know, I still don't know how my stomach feels, we can ask probing questions, right? Do your cheeks feel hot? Or does your head feel like it hurts? Or do you feel like you can breathe normally? And if we've checked in before, if we've done this stomach, chest, throat, cheeks before, if we're doing it during escalation, usually there's something that we've already said, it doesn't feel like it did earlier today, or it doesn't feel, and saying it doesn't feel good is also okay. Allowing for space to create the words is what connects us when we name it. Okay, so the next activity is stop. And so when we're talking about stop, I will admit, I have trouble with stop sometimes because the word itself is kind of abrasive. So during escalation, if we haven't properly set up stop can feel too abrasive, and sometimes I get a little bit of friction for it. So if you set it up beforehand and we talk through stop, the first letter is stop. So stop what you're doing, stop, whether it's typing or playing, we stop what we're doing, we find stillness, we take a breath. And that stop and take a breath, just those 2, is a really helpful way to start talking about this, right? So I think that often we don't talk about our breath enough, but that taking a breath in can really help to start to discuss what it is to inhale and feel the expansion, the diaphragm go down, etc. And so then once we've stopped and we've taken a breath, we can open. So I always say, open your eyes, like open up and look around in a bigger space. So we've stopped, we've taken a breath, and then we open up and we are looking at something, our surroundings, or what is happening in a bigger way. And that's expanding our horizon. And then the P is be present. So we stop, we take a breath, we open up, and we be present. And that practice helps us take us through the get yourself safe, breathe in, feel your whole chest, open up to your surroundings, and then you get to choose. So yeah, does anyone have any questions about stop or about the yours or mine emotions? Okay, so I'm gonna, Monica says, oh, yeah. You know what, Monica? I love that. So Monica says, if often trying to make a joke changes the child's mood, is that bad? Or I often, but we totally understand it. So there are a lot of really, really great researchers that work around humor and how important humor is. And I don't think that it's bad at all. In fact, I think that being able to, as a child, as an adult, as all of us, experience, I'm having this emotion and now I can laugh at it and my emotions can change, is really, really important. I'm going to be probably a little bit self-deprecating and say that I'm like really, really bad at humor. I'm just not a funny person. And so it's really hard for me to try, especially during escalation, it's really hard for me to make a joke and try to change a child's affect. But I think that's where our individual differences really do come into play. And humor has been found to be really, really useful in situations like escalation. So I'm going to talk about the very last one. And sometimes the reason why So if anybody's interested in Brifwa, breathe, relax, feel, watch, and allow, that's that last activity listed. But now I'm going to talk a little bit about downtime. And I think that some of the activities that we talked about in the two previous slides are spaces where we can all do it in downtime. We can introduce, and maybe we want to introduce those sorts of things before escalation happens. But there's also some spaces that we can have these practices that we then add in. And so RAIN is probably the most commonly done in different mindfulness settings. RAIN is a mindfulness practice. And so the term is recognize, allow, investigate, and then the final is non-identification or sometimes, non-identification or sometimes non-attachment. And the way that we incorporate RAIN, the reason why I didn't put RAIN in the during escalation and I put it into this is that it's a really important practice to do before we escalate. We can all practice this. This is done in MBSR and a lot of the adult mindfulness classes, and a lot of people really like this practice. But the idea is that we first recognize, or if you think about that cycle, it's appraisal, and we recognize an uncomfortable emotion. So maybe this is when Chelsea was asking about whether or not to do it during escalation or later. RAIN is a practice that we can do later. We can say, hey, do you remember when we had that tantrum in the middle of the toy store? Let's recognize, let's talk about recognizing what that was. And then that acceptance is really important. And I know that as parents, we don't want to accept bad behavior, but it's okay to say, you know what, I've had tantrums too, and I'm going to accept that and love you no matter what, because then that allows that safety. When we feel safe, when our parasympathetic nervous system is activated, right? Our brain is saying, this is a safe surrounding, I'm accepted. Then we can investigate. Why did we act like that? Why did we have that tantrum? What happened to make that, to make us need to stomp our feet around and scream? And then we do this practice of non-attachment. And I know it sounds really, really esoteric, but not attaching or non-judgment, that last N in RAIN, is a way that we can say, you are not your tantrum. And it's okay to recognize that this was the emotion, to accept that it happened, to think about why it happened, and to say, that's not who you are. And maybe then in the next time where you feel those things that we just investigated, maybe if you know that's not you or that's not who you are, maybe we can stop the escalation from happening. The other, so Chelsea says, for the yours and mine exercise, which is the during escalation, does it mean that we are projecting our feelings on them? Sometimes I think that her daughter, Charlie, is more upset because she's sad that I get so sad. Yes. So you know what? I thank you so much, Chelsea, and thank you for sharing something so personal. I think it's really important for us to be able to allow for our children and our students and ourselves and our partners to recognize what they're feeling, and then what they're feeling that's ours too. So for example, if Charlie and I were in a room and I was really, really sad because I had to leave, and Charlie started to get really sad, and you can kind of see that escalation, and maybe even in the past, I've wanted to leave and Charlie said, and that has made me stay. Then that's where I could say, hey, Charlie, let's talk about your emotions. Do you think that those are your emotions, or are they my emotions? What are you really feeling? And it actually allows for that space to say this idea of projection is real. Sometimes I'm really sad because you're really sad. And I could then say, you know what, Charlie, I'm feeling really sad. And I think maybe part of it is because I'm sad that you're sad. And this is this cycle, or this like space where we are accepting that we're two beings that are feeling together and not as separate. I think that maybe that answered the question, maybe not. Okay, so Mary Beth says, sometimes I look at my child as crying. Sometimes I will look at my child as a crying fit at the beginning and say, is this a real cry, or are you going to laugh any minute now? And when I start to laugh, she usually joins in, and the crying ends. So the question is this a good thing, or are you ignoring, or am I ignoring important emotions that should be addressed? And Mary Beth, what a beautiful question. And I already can tell you that because you're introspective and thinking about whether or not it's a good thing, it probably is. Like I was mentioning earlier, humor is great to introduce. And you're using your version of, is it yours or is it mine, by saying, is it real? And in fact, I have a few clients that I work with that is this real is the yours or mine game, right? So is this a real feeling that I'm having, or is this something that I'm making up, or a story that I'm telling myself? And that's a little bit older and more of a cognitive space where we tell our own stories, but it is really that same, is this yours? Am I identifying what this is? And I think that childhood is a time where we start to get affect, and then we explore, we experiment. And what a beautiful thing to be able to learn how to start to feel sad and realize we can laugh and we can feel happy at the same time. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the last 3 downtime spaces that we can, practices that we can introduce. Gratitude there is a wealth of research that we're starting to really find on gratitude practices, both in adults and adolescents and some children too, that we're seeing the practice of gratitude, the actual practice of, even in, I know you guys have really busy schedules, even in our busy schedules, being able to sit back and say, this is what I'm grateful for, is a really helpful practice to build the neural pathways of empathy, of connection, of attunement, and also to help us regulate the spaces of appraisal. And so it could be as easy as every night saying, this is what I'm grateful for. I know one of my friends has a journal, and it has been years, and every night she just writes down 3 things that she's grateful for. But it can also be a bigger practice of taking milestones, like I've just finished my soccer season, and so I'm going to write a thank you note to the soccer teacher. And it's those sorts of things that I think maybe as really busy. I know you guys are so busy, and I don't know how you do it all. And I know how hard it is to add these things that feel like, oh, I'm writing a thank you note. But if I can encourage the practice, because it really is helping our children and all of our children develop, small things like gratitude really do help build and develop that social and emotional learning. So last 2 are the ladder breathing and the empathy map. I'm actually going to do ladder breathing with you guys. So I'm going to jump to the empathy map and explain it quickly, and then we can all do ladder breathing together before the final Q&A. So what an empathy map is: during downtime, this is a space where you can be creative. You can use drawings. You can also use software like mind mapping software. And it starts to build, Mark Brackett talks a lot about, in his program called Ruler, he talks a lot about labeling emotions and how important it is to label emotions and to think about how they impact each other. An empathy map is drawing out different emotions that we feel, and we can do it like we talked about the tantrum later on. We can talk about emotions that we felt earlier today or this week or something that happened, or we could just talk about emotions. We can even talk about stories and map our characters' emotions, which is really helpful because then it's not us, but we're talking about somebody else's emotions. And then we map this emotion leads to or is connected to this emotion, is connected to this emotion. And all of this gives us verbal tools that we can use during escalation to reconnect the frontal lobe. So finally is ladder breathing. The science behind ladder breathing is that we talked about the vagal nerve, and that there's all these afferent and efferent spaces in the vagal nerve. What we're actually talking about is what doctors call vagal tone. And so vagal tone is the myelination of the nerve, which is essentially the bubble wrap around the nerve. And so the more myelination around this vagal nerve that we have, the more protection around it, the easier it is for us to start to understand, to appraise, to attune our attention to what's happening. And so if we are increasing myelination, or some very smart people think that if we're massaging the vagal nerve, that we're helping increase this ability to receive information. And so we're going to all do this activity together. And this is something that you can do with your kids too. And it's something that you can do on your own. I do it with my athletes a lot. This is called ladder breathing. So if you think about your whole cavity, all the way from the top of your nose down, breathe in all the way, fill the belly, fill the chest, and then breathe all the way out. So we'll take just one more full breath so you can kind of feel from the nose all the way down to the very base of whatever's touching the floor or chair, and then all the way out. So in a ladder breath, we're going to breathe in for 1, 2, breathe all the way to the belly, hold the breath for 1, breathe in 1, 2 to your chest, hold the breath, breathe in all the way, hold the breath, and then exhale everything out. So we're going to do that 2 more times. Breathe all the way in, fill the belly, 1, 2, hold. Breathe in, fill the ribs, 1, 2, hold. Breathe all the way up to the chest and throat, 1, 2, hold. Hold, keep holding, and exhale everything out. So we're going to do that one more time. Breathe in, fill the belly. 1, 2, hold. Fill the chest. 2, hold. Fill all the way up. And exhale everything out. So that's ladder breathing. For the little ones, breathing in 2 times. Breathe into the belly 1, 2, and the chest 1, 2, and then exhale out really helps. And up to adults, you can do it up to 4 times with this ladder. We're stepping all the way up. We're filling the whole cavity. And what this does is it helps increase our vagal tone. It helps what some people would think, you can imagine it like massaging the vagal nerve, and that helps us receive information. But it also helps us really learn how to take full breaths. So we allow for the full expansion of the diaphragm and fill and release. And that increases our awareness of the nerves that get all of that, the afferent and efferent nerves that receive information, as well as how we're feeling. And eventually you can start to include something like ladder breathing during escalation, because we've associated it with safe space. And so if we're starting to feel and escalate, we can include things like this ladder breathing that brings us back to that association we have for safe space. So that's ladder breathing. And I'd love to hear any more questions and talk a little bit more about you guys. And I do have I have the discussion up and these comments are coming up. I'd love to hear more about what sorts of things that you do with your kiddos to help encourage empathy and emotional development. All right, so Robert says, way to incorporate the mindful practice of knowing that I'm mad, but it's just an emotion. Oh my goodness, and it's impertinent and will change. Yes, so much. So this idea of acceptance, if you guys remember that RAIN activity, that A for acceptance is so important, that this is just something that I'm feeling and not who I am, and that feelings change. And so many of you had these great anecdotes with humor and adding humor when we're escalating. And that is another experience of, like Robert was saying, I know that I'm mad, but that's not who I am. And it's impermanent. It will change. And I think that, gosh, it's so important, even as we know now that our emotions are just our brain's guessing. And so we can start to come back to, okay, what is really the situation? What am I really feeling? How then do I want to respond? And it becomes our choice. Thank you so much for that. So we've been through all of the material that I wanted to make sure that I could give you guys. And I really want to be here for questions and answer any questions. So I think I'll be here for maybe another 2 minutes, 2 or 3 minutes, and then I can continue to stay in our group discussion until for the next 20 minutes. So we can also discuss in there. If you guys go away and get a coffee and decide that you want to ask more questions, that discussion will be there. Oh my goodness. I love this. Thank you, Chelsea. So Charlie Ann wrote that she's thankful for her pumpkin. Is that right? What an awesome way to do that, is to get a pumpkin and to write down what she's thankful for. And especially now in the season, as our seasons change, to be able to insert that gratitude. Yeah, thank you so much. Do you guys have who else has other Thanksgiving or gratitude activities that they'd like to share? I know we've been talking about empathy and mindfulness a lot now, so it's okay if you don't want to share some of your. You can also add it into the chat. And what's great is that we can. Oh, thank you, Monica. Thank you so much for joining. So you can rewatch the broadcast, and this will be on Moshi social pages. So if you joined late and there was some things that I mentioned about some of the science stuff earlier, then you can join into the earlier, and that will be there for quite a while. So I'll give it just a little bit more time. I'm just so grateful to be able to talk to you guys this Sunday. I'm really grateful for you and for Moshi. I think it's such a cool platform to be able to talk about social emotional learning more. Well, if nobody has any more questions, thank you guys so much for joining us. And I'll keep up to date on that discussion board for a little bit longer. If you guys have anything to write, feel free to join in. Otherwise, thank you and have wonderful days. Oh, I'm so grateful. Thank you, Chelsea. I love that. I'm gonna start writing gratitude on my pumpkins too, just for you guys. All right. Thanks, you guys. Bye-bye.